So this is the Elgato Facecam Mark II. It is a 1080p 60 frames per second maximum resolution and frame rate camera. And today I'm going to do something a little bit unorthodox, and I'm going to compare it against a couple of 4K cameras, the Logitech MX Brio as well as the Brio 4K from 2017. Now those cameras are capable of 4K, but they're also capable of 1080p at 60 frames per second. So what I'm going to do is compare all three of the different cameras. And I'm going to start out with the Mark II Facecam with its default image. Then I'm going to look at its tuned image and how I tuned it. And then we're going to compare that against the different Logitech cameras, the MX Brio and the 4K Brio. Let's go. Okay, this is the Elgato Facecam Mark II with all the default settings: contrast at 80, saturation at 50, automatic exposure turned on with center weighted kind of as the option there. I'm just scrolling down here. White balance is automatic. It looks like it's picked up by 5000 Kelvin lighting. Anti-flickers at 60 Hertz and noise reductions at medium. So all the things are exactly how they come out of the box once you update the camera firmware and also your camera hub if you already have one installed on the Elgato Facecam Mark II. Alright, so this is the Facecam Mark II with some tuned settings. I just changed it a little bit. I actually liked really the way that the default image looked. I think the shadows actually look a little bit nicer even than when I tried to give it a bit more dynamic range. So what I've done here is I've actually turned off the white balance and I've set that to 5000 Kelvins, which is more or less I think where it was at in terms of auto white balance. But just to be sure, I set it to where my lights are at. ISO, I've got it at 316 and shutter speed at 1/90. I tried it at 1/120, which is normally where I'd go with something like a 60 frames per second image, but 1/90 was actually a little bit better in terms of the way that the shadows and things looked in terms of shutter speed. The higher you go, or I should say the lower you go, the more light is getting in, and then basically it kind of blows out the image. And I've also got just a couple of settings. Sharpness, I kicked up to about 56%, so 6% over default, which isn't a lot. And then contrast at 90%, and it looks pretty sharp. But I think some of the autofocus lenses, might do a little bit better just because they don't have that fixed focus attribute to them. Alright, so let's compare a couple of cameras. Now I've got the Logitech Brio. It's a 4K camera, but I have it running at 1080p 60 frames per second. That is on the right-hand side of your screen. The big difference that you're seeing is kind of the more purple background, which is about that kind of color tuning and color balance out of the box. It's always a bit more skewed to the yellowish side, and I've toned down the blue lights behind me compared to what I'd normally do, just so it doesn't throw it out too much. And then I've got the Facecam Mark II that's on your left. It's on my right, but it's got a more accurate skin tone and background in terms of coloring and what it looks like in real life, at least what I see on my screen right now. So just to compare the two cameras, I think that the Brio actually looks a little bit sharper than the Elgato Facecam Mark II, which might be because the Elgato Facecam Mark II is a fixed focus lens. There's no motor or anything that's trying to focus me in a little bit. And if you really want to look, you can look at my hair or the detail in my eyes, and then you can probably see and gauge what that looks like from a kind of sharpness perspective. Now on the Brio, I would say the downfall of that camera is the fact that the motion isn't as fluid. So if I do this, for example, you can see there's a lot of motion blur then on the Brio side, whereas there's not a lot of motion blur on the Elgato Facecam Mark II. So for the motion, it's winning on the Facecam Mark II, whereas I think on the image quality, maybe not the color balance, but like the sharpness of it, if you're all about tack sharpness, I think the Brio 4K running at 1080p 60, even at 4K it does pretty well, but in terms of its image sharpness, it's doing a really good job. Alright, so now I've got the MX Brio this time that is on your right-hand side on my left, and the Facecam Mark II on your left side, my right. So now you can see the difference between the two of them. I would still say that the Facecam Mark II has better accuracy in terms of colors, background, etc. And my skin tones, just the way that it looks in terms of the composition of the image. So I can either kind of correct for one or the other, the background correctness or the skin tone correctness, it seems like. but it's more accurate, the Facecam Mark II. That said, though, the Logitech Brio does look really good. I'm looking at my screen and kind of comparing the two. The background does look way more blue, so the colors are a lot more vibrant. It's a bit more touchy in terms of kind of configuring the white balance and the tint and all of those kind of things to try to get to kind of somewhat match the other two. And you can tell in terms of the field of view on the camera itself that the Brio MX is a bit more punched in. It's not quite as wide of frame as what I have in the Facecam Mark II. The other thing I would say versus especially the Brio 4K is that the fluid motion is about the same for both cameras. So if I do this, whereas there was a lot of motion blur coming from the Brio 4K, this one's very smooth on the MX Brio, and it's also very smooth coming from the Facecam Mark II. Alright, so let's compare one more thing, because the MX Brio and the Facecam Mark II both tout their ability to run in low light. So as you can tell, I'm in a very low light. I don't have anything that's directed at my face in terms of lighting. Okay, so now you've seen all the different cameras, how they compare with one another. So let's have a look at the camera itself. So the Mark II Elgato Facecam actually has a USB-C port on the back like the Mark I. It is a bit lower profile, so you can keep your eyes closer to the monitor as you stream or go into online meetings, those types of things. The one thing that's different with this one is because it has a shutter on the front of it, so you can actually close that to protect the lens, or you can actually slide it open from here. One thing that I would say is it's because it's really close to the lens, you want to stay away from that with your finger. It's very easy to get fingerprints on the glass lens, but at least it doesn't make it so you lose the kind of shutter cover like you had in the Mark I. So a couple of different upgrades there. My thoughts on this, I would say that the focus and sharpness and clarity of the original 2017 Brio 4K was a bit nicer in a lot of ways than the Mark II, as well as even the MX Brio. It actually really holds its own from an optics stack perspective. And in terms of focus and sharpness, the MX Brio has a slight edge also over the Mark II Facecam, but I gotta say, from a color balance perspective, and you saw it in all the different images, I looked like I had very, very blue eyes and a very blue background on the MX Brio, and I looked like I had a very purple background when you look at the Brio 4K. Yes, you can kind of correct that if you want to correct the RGB lighting behind you and really focus on skin tones, which you can do, and I'd recommend actually. But I would say from a color accuracy perspective, and you've seen this also in some of the maybe other reviews that you've looked at, the Mark II Facecam is doing a lot better in terms of making it look more like the room that I'm in looks in real life. But you know, the cost, I would say, is that because there's no autofocus, it's a fixed focus camera, you are maybe giving up a little bit of sharpness in terms of the look and feel of the camera versus something like the Brio even from 2017, where it did focus hunt a little bit, as you noticed, and also the MX Brio, where it's a little bit better in terms of getting a little bit sharper. There's not really a definitive winner in terms of all three of the cameras. They all have their highlights. I'd say the Brio 4K does really well in terms of clarity and sharpness of image. The MX Brio does a good job in terms of bringing that, as well as pretty decent color accuracy, bit more sharpness and clarity than the Mark II Facecam, but the Mark II Facecam is a bit better in terms of color accuracy, and it's $50 cheaper than the MX Brio is right now, but it's also made out of almost all plastic material, so it doesn't quite feel as nice in the hand or look quite as nice from a materials perspective as the MX Brio does. So hopefully this review helps in terms of your next webcam purchase, especially if you're planning to stream at 1080p with 60 frames per second. If you like the video, be sure to give me a like. Subscribe to my channel for more reviews like this and also software tips. And thanks so much for watching.